I stood there, in the middle of that tiny chapel, watching a rose petal fall from the Virgin of Guadalupe's mantle and land precisely at my sister Anna's feet. You have no idea what that meant to me in that moment. I, who spent my entire life calling that image a demon, a devil's artifice, a pagan superstition, was seeing something my mind couldn't explain. The petal fell as if guided by invisible hands, and Anna, who had barely been able to breathe for weeks, smiled for the first time in months. The sound of that laughter echoed through the entire chapel, and I felt my world crumble and rebuild at the same time. Let me tell you how I got there, because this story didn't begin that night in the chapel. It began much earlier, in rural Brazil, in an evangelical family where any image of a saint was seen as the work of the devil. My name is John Michael, and I grew up believing wholeheartedly that Catholics were deceived, that they venerated idols instead of worshiping the true God. My father was a deacon in our church, and since I was little, I heard him talk about papist superstitions and the deceptions of the Roman Church. I remember once, when I was about 8 years old, I brought home a holy card of Our Lady that a Catholic classmate had given me at school. My mother nearly fainted when she saw it, and my father burned that holy card in the backyard while offering a prayer for protection against demons. Back then, I thought it was all normal, you know? That's how things worked in our house. I grew up being taught that Catholics were idolaters, that they venerated dead images instead of worshiping the living God. And I believed it with all my might. By the time I reached adolescence, I was preaching in church on Sundays, repeating the exact same words I heard from the pastor. Even the darkness of Guadalupe cannot withstand the light of our God. I said it with conviction, with pride, thinking I was defending the truth against lies. My specialty was attacking Marian devotion. I studied the apparitions, the reported miracles, and turned all of that into arguments to show how Catholics were deceived. The Virgin of Guadalupe, then, was my favorite target. I said it was an invention of the Spanish conquistadors to dominate the Mexican Indians, that it was nothing more than pagan syncretism disguised as Christianity. How many times did I not get up on the pulpit to expose these diabolical superstitions? I was known in the region as one of the most fervent preachers of our denomination. In my 20s, I had already visited dozens of churches to talk about the dangers of Catholicism. My passion was to open people's eyes, to show them how they were being deceived. I truly believed I was doing God's work, saving souls from damnation. Life went on like this for years. I got married, started a family, continued preaching, and living a life I considered exemplary. But God sometimes has other plans for us, and those plans are not always comfortable. In 2019, my younger sister, Anna, began to show strange symptoms. She had always been a healthy girl, full of life, but suddenly she started having difficulty breathing, getting tired easily, losing weight inexplicably. At first, we thought it was something simple, maybe anemia, a common respiratory problem. But the symptoms worsened, and when we finally managed to take her to a specialist, the diagnosis was like a punch to the stomach. A rare disease affecting her lungs that had no known cure. The doctor was blunt. You need to prepare for the worst. I remember leaving that office in shock. What do you mean, prepare for the worst? Anna was only 16. She was just starting life. She dreamed of being a teacher, loved children, had a smile that lit up any room. How could God allow this to happen to such a pure, innocent girl? In those first days after the diagnosis, I clung to faith like never before. I organized prayer groups at church, fasted, cried out to God day and night. I was sure He would heal my sister. After all, wasn't I the one who spent my life defending the power of our God against all superstitions? Wasn't I the one who preached about the miracles only Jesus could perform? But the days went by and Anna continued to worsen. She lost weight, her breathing became more and more difficult, and she reached a point where she could barely climb a flight of stairs. Our parents spent all their savings on experimental treatments, consultations with renowned doctors, expensive medicines that made no difference at all. And I continued praying, fasting, preaching about the faith that moves mountains. That's when we decided to take her to Sao Paulo to consult with a world-renowned doctor in this type of disease. I was sure he would have the answer, the solution we were looking for. We sold the car, borrowed money, and made the trip, with Anna already very debilitated. I remember that on the bus, she was leaning on my shoulder, breathing with difficulty, and asked me, "John, why do you think God is allowing this to happen to me?" I didn't know what to answer. For the first time in my life, the words I always used to comfort others seemed empty in my own mouth. In Sao Paulo, we stayed in a simple boarding house near the hospital. Anna was admitted for a series of tests, and I spent the nights in the corridor, praying and trying to understand what was happening. It was there, in those cold, impersonal corridors, that I began to question many things I had always believed. I saw the suffering of so many people, so many families shattered by grief, and I wondered where was the God I preached about, the God who should be healing, comforting, saving. One night, while walking around the neighborhood looking for a place to eat, I passed a small chapel. A sign out front read, "Our Lady of Guadalupe Chapel." I stopped in front and felt a mix of anger and despair. How many times had I attacked this very invocation in my sermons? How many times had I warned people about the dangers of this devotion? But there, in that moment of despair, I felt something different. It wasn't the arrogant certainty I'd always had. It was a doubt that began to grow in my heart. What if I was wrong? What if, in my search for truth, I had closed myself off to other ways God might manifest himself? I returned to the hospital with this doubt hammering in my head. Anna was getting worse each day, and the doctors started talking about palliative care. I couldn't accept it. I couldn't accept that all my faith, my entire life dedicated to serving God, wasn't enough to save my sister. That's when my mother, who had come to stay with us, made a suggestion that infuriated me. "John, what if we visited that little chapel you passed? Sometimes God uses other paths to reach us." I exploded. How could she suggest such a thing? How could she even think of seeking help in the very place I'd always fought against? But Anna, weak as she was, held my hand and said, "John, I can't take it anymore. If there's any chance at all, I want to try. I don't have the strength left to keep choosing where help can come from." Those words cut me like a sword. I saw the despair in my sister's eyes, and for the first time in my life, my theological pride seemed insignificant in the face of her suffering. That night, against all my instincts, against everything I'd always believed, I agreed to accompany my mother and Anna to the chapel. I went in expecting to feel revulsion, expecting my true faith to revolt against that idolatry. But what I felt was something completely different. The chapel was filled with lit candles, and the air smelled of incense mixed with flowers. People were praying silently, others lighting candles, and some placing ex-votos on a sidewall. It was an atmosphere of a peace I had never experienced. It wasn't the peace of the theological certainty I knew, but a different peace, deeper, more welcoming. Anna leaned against a chair in the front row, and my mother knelt beside her. I stood in the back, observing everything with a mixture of fascination and resistance. A small choir was singing a song in Spanish, and even without understanding the words, I felt they touched something very deep in my heart. And then I looked at the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. It was an old painting with colors that seemed to glow even in the dim light of the chapel. The eyes of the image had an expression of compassion I had never noticed before. For all those years attacking this devotion, I had never really looked at the Virgin's face. I only saw idol, papist superstition, deception. But there, in that moment, I saw something different. That's when what I told you at the beginning happened. A rose petal fell from the image's mantle and landed exactly at Anna's feet. I saw it with my own eyes, and I wasn't alone. Several people in the chapel saw the same thing. It wasn't imagination, it wasn't suggestion. It was real, concrete, inexplicable. Anna smiled, and that smile made me crumble. All my arrogance, all my certainty that I was right and everyone else was wrong, all of it disappeared in that instant. I knelt right there in the back of the chapel and cried as I had never cried in my life. At that moment, I wasn't thinking about theology, denominations, or who was right or wrong. I was just seeing my sister smile after weeks of suffering and feeling that something bigger than I could comprehend was happening there. We returned to the hospital that night, and something extraordinary happened. Anna, who for days could barely breathe on her own, began to show signs of improvement. The doctors couldn't explain what was happening. The next day's tests showed a significant improvement in her lungs, an improvement that had no medical explanation. I know that some of you who are hearing this story may be thinking it was coincidence, that it was the medical treatment taking effect, that it was anything but a miracle. I understand that reaction because that's exactly what I thought at first. My rational mind was searching for explanations for what had happened. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen. I couldn't pretend that rose petal hadn't fallen, that Anna hadn't smiled at that moment, that her improvement hadn't begun exactly that night. And more importantly, I couldn't ignore the peace I felt in that chapel, a peace that was unlike anything I had ever known. In the following weeks, Anna continued to improve. It wasn't an instant cure, but it was a constant and inexplicable improvement. And I began to question everything I had always believed. Not about God, not about Jesus, but about the way I had limited God's action to my theological concepts alone. I began to research the history of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and what I discovered shook me even more. The apparition in 1531, the roses that fell before Juan Diego, the miracles reported over the centuries, all of it took on a different meaning for me now. I discovered that devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe has always been linked to the defense of the poor, the marginalized, those without a voice. How could I have spent so many years attacking this? If you're following this story, please subscribe to the channel to continue receiving accounts like this, because what happened from that moment on completely changed my life and might touch your hearts too. A few nights later, still processing everything that had happened, I had a dream that marked my life forever. I was walking through a desert, an arid and desolate place, when suddenly roses began to sprout from the ground. Pink roses, fragrant, beautiful, growing amidst the stones and sand. And in the sky, I saw the face of the Virgin of Guadalupe, looking at me with tenderness, extending her hands towards me. She offered me a luminous veil, and when I touched it, I felt a peace I can't describe with words. It was as if all the conflicts, all the doubts, all the fears were dissolved in a feeling of unconditional love. When I woke up, my room was perfumed with the scent of roses, and one of my sheets had a subtle mark, as if it had been touched by something fragrant. It may sound crazy, it may sound like fantasy, but I know what I felt, I know what I experienced. And from that moment on, my life took a completely different direction. When we returned to our town, I knew I would have to face one of the most difficult decisions of my life. How to tell my church, my family, everyone who knew me as a fervent defender of the evangelical faith, that I had experienced something supernatural in a Catholic chapel. At first, I tried to keep it a secret. I continued preaching, continued attending services, but something had changed within me. I could no longer attack Marian devotion with the same conviction as before. I could no longer call something demonic that had brought me so much peace. It was Anna who encouraged me to tell the truth. She, who continued to improve day by day, told me, "John, you can't live a lie. If God used the Virgin of Guadalupe to heal me, then that's part of the truth, isn't it?" She was right, as always. I decided to tell my experience first to the pastor of our church. I expected incomprehension, perhaps even accusations of heresy, and that's exactly what happened. He told me that I had been deceived by the devil, that false miracles were one of the enemy's weapons to confuse the faithful. He said I needed to repent and return to the truth. But I couldn't see things that way anymore. I could no longer believe that a God of love would use my sister's suffering to deceive me. I could no longer believe that the peace I felt in that chapel was the work of the devil. When I told my experience to the church, the reaction was even worse. Some members accused me of being possessed. Others said I needed spiritual deliverance. Some even suggested that I should be expelled from the church. It was one of the most painful moments of my life. But something interesting happened too. Some people approached me after the service, discreetly, and told me they had felt the sincerity of my testimony. One woman told me that her daughter had been healed in a Catholic church years ago, but that she had never had the courage to tell anyone. A young man told me he had always had doubts about the rigidity of our doctrine, but that he had never dared to question anything. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. There were other people who, like me, had experienced God in different ways, but were afraid to talk about it. People who had been taught to limit God's action only to their own denominations, but who deep down knew that God is greater than any theological box. So I decided to organize ecumenical meetings, not for syncretism, not to mix doctrines, but to share faith experiences. I invited Catholics, evangelicals, people from different denominations to talk about how God had manifested himself in our lives. The first meeting was small, only 5 people, but each one had a story to tell, a unique experience of how God had touched their lives. I heard accounts of healings, of consolations, of divine guidance that had happened in contexts very different from mine. A Catholic woman told how she had been cured of cancer after a novena to Our Lady of Aparecida. A Pentecostal young man talked about how he had received a revelation during a prayer in tongues. A Baptist woman shared how God had spoken to her through a dream. And I told my experience with the Virgin of Guadalupe. What impressed me was realizing that despite the doctrinal differences, all these experiences had something in common: the love of God manifesting itself in the lives of people who were suffering, who were searching, who were open to receive. The meetings grew, and today we have a group of more than 50 people from different denominations who meet monthly to share faith experiences. Not to debate theology, not to convert anyone, but to celebrate the diversity of God's action in our lives. The first meeting was small, only 5 people, but each one had a story to tell, a unique experience of how God had touched their lives. I heard accounts of healings, of consolations, of divine guidance that had happened in contexts very different from mine. A Catholic woman told how she had been cured of cancer after a novena to Our Lady of Aparecida. A Pentecostal young man talked about how he had received a revelation during a prayer in tongues. A Baptist woman shared how God had spoken to her through a dream. And I told my experience with the Virgin of Guadalupe. What impressed me was realizing that despite the doctrinal differences, all these experiences had something in common: the love of God manifesting itself in the lives of people who were suffering, who were searching, who were open to receive. The meetings grew, and today we have a group of more than 50 people from different denominations who meet monthly to share faith experiences. Not to debate theology, not to convert anyone, but to celebrate the diversity of God's action in our lives. Of course, this didn't come without conflict. My original church ended up expelling me, and some members of my family stopped talking to me. It was painful, very painful. But I learned that sometimes the price of truth is high, and that not everyone is ready to accept that God can act in ways different from those we are accustomed to. Anna, who was the catalyst for all this transformation, continues well. Her healing wasn't instantaneous, but it was real and lasting. Doctors never fully explained what happened, but for us, the explanation isn't the most important thing. The important thing is that she is alive, she is healthy, and she is serving God in her own way. She became a teacher, as she always dreamed, and works at a public school in an underprivileged community. She tells me that she carries the experience of that night in the chapel with her, and that it makes her more compassionate with her students, more open to different forms of faith, more willing to see God in unexpected places. I also changed professions. I stopped being a professional preacher and went back to working as a carpenter, a profession I learned from my grandfather when I was a child. But I continued to serve God, only in a different way. Today, I build altars for different denominations, Catholic and Evangelical, and in each piece of wood I work on, I place a prayer that that space be used to bring people closer to God. You know, there's something I learned from this whole experience. God is much bigger than our theologies. He can use a rose petal in a Catholic chapel to touch the heart of an evangelical preacher. He can use the suffering of a girl to open the eyes of a proud brother. He can use the encounter of different traditions to show that love is greater than doctrinal differences. I'm not saying that all religions are the same, or that there are no important differences between them. I'm saying that God can use any of them to manifest Himself, and that our task is not to limit God's action, but to be open to recognizing it wherever it happens. Today, when I pass by a Catholic church, I no longer feel anger or contempt. I feel respect for people who are seeking God in their own way. When I see an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, I no longer see idolatry. I see the face of compassion, the symbol of hope for those who suffer, the reminder that God leans down to hear the cry of the afflicted. And when someone asks me if I've become Catholic, I reply that I've become more Christian. I didn't change denominations, but I broadened my understanding of how God can act. I didn't abandon my evangelical faith, but I enriched it with the experience of seeing God beyond the boundaries I had created myself. Sometimes I go back to that chapel in Sao Paulo. I go there to thank, to remember, to renew my faith in God's ability to surprise. And every time I go, I bring a rose. Not because I believe the image needs it, but because I want to remember that God can use even a rose petal to transform a life. The last thing I want to share with you is a reflection I make every day. How many times, in the name of defending our faith, do we attack legitimate manifestations of God's love? How many times does our theological pride prevent us from recognizing God's action in unexpected places? How many times do our certainties blind us to the truth? I spent years thinking I was defending God, but I was actually limiting God. I thought I knew all the ways He could act, but I discovered that His ways are infinitely broader than I imagined. Today, I live a more humble, more open, more awe-filled faith. I discovered that it's possible to be faithful to your convictions without disrespecting the convictions of others. It's possible to maintain your beliefs without attacking the beliefs of others. It's possible to serve God without trying to control the ways He chooses to manifest Himself. And if this story touched your heart in some way, if it made you think about your own certainties, about your own limitations, then it has fulfilled its purpose. Because in the end, what matters is not being right, but being open to receiving God's love in every possible way. Thank you for listening. May God bless you in whatever way He chooses to do so.